welcome back to Refuge, finding home in a world of change. Can you believe that we've already come to the final session? Before we jump into session 6, which covers the 4th chapter of Ruth, I want to thank you for participating in this adventure with me. Whether you've been in a small group with a number of people, maybe you're using this in your Sunday school class, maybe it's just you and your family at home, quite possibly you're just streaming this all by yourself. Regardless, this has been a rich time of study, and I just want to thank you for your hospitality and your trust of inviting me and the ministry of Walk Through the Bible to help you grow in your walk with Him and ignite your passion for His Word. Remember in session 1, I told you that I believe this book has never been more relevant and needed than it is today. Hopefully, as we've studied this amazing story, God has used our time together to connect with the real world issues in our country today and beyond, but also the personal needs in your own life. It's so amazing how God can simultaneously give us the big macro, culture-wide, worldwide view, but also use those same verses by the Holy Spirit to come just straight to our heart and have a personal conversation with us as individuals. I hope that you'll join me again in the future for another adventure in God's Word using one of Walk Through the Bible's other studies in our Biblical Character series. So far, we have courses on David, Old Testament Joseph, Mary, the mother of Jesus, King Josiah, and Simon Peter, with more to come. So look for titles like Crucible, Detour, Chosen, Revolution, and Chiseled. And I hope that we can continue this learning adventure together. And now let's dig into the exciting conclusion to the amazing book of Ruth. Chapter 3 ended with, again, on a cliffhanger, with Naomi telling Ruth, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." We talked in our last session about how there's great value in initiative. We want to be people who are change agents, who make things happen. Some of us that comes easy to, others it's more a struggle. But either way, there still comes a time when we make the plans, but God determines the outcome. And that's what is happening here. It's a time of waiting. We don't know really how Boaz is going to respond. We found out that there's a closer relative. How's he going to figure in all this? There's a lot going on. But Naomi's assessment of Boaz turns out to be right on target. Look what we see in the first verse of chapter 4. It says, "Meanwhile." It could be that even right at the time when Ruth has brought her report to Naomi and Naomi is saying, "All right, Ruth, you just need to wait. But if I know Boaz, it's not going to take long." It could be literally as they're having that conversation, the events of chapter 4 start to unfold. It says, "Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, 'Come over here, my friend, and sit down.' So he went over and sat down. And Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, 'Sit here.' And they did so." This scene takes place at the town gate, which is so much more than just the entrance to the city. The town gate was the center of commerce and really functioned a lot like our city halls would today. It's the place where decisions are made, where things are officially ratified, where public announcements are made. And the fact that the town elders immediately respond to Boaz's request validates his position of influence as a man of good standing. They didn't say, "Well, we're meeting 3 weeks from Tuesday. We're building the agenda now. Send me an email about that. We'll see if we'll have time." He asked for their attention and they immediately responded. And now we have this spontaneous meeting. Verse 3, "Then Boaz said to the guardian redeemer, 'Naomi, who has come home from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am the next in line. I will redeem it, he said. Boaz gives the closer relative the opportunity to purchase Naomi's property. This was in keeping with the law. This was doing things in an orderly fashion. The closer relative had legal priority, first option, to purchase Elimelech's property and keep it from leaving the family. The closer relative initially accepts the offer. Remember his simple statement, I will do it. Verse 5, before we even get to verse 5, isn't your heart beating faster? Aren't you going, wait, I'm on Team Boaz in this. He's the one who first took the risk on Ruth. He's the one who's expressed compassion. Here's this guy, I don't care about who's got priority in the family tree. I'm for Boaz. That's the relationship that's already started to blossom. Come on, this can't go off track now. If you and I are thinking that, what must Boaz be thinking? In verse 5, Boaz says, almost casually, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. I want to someday in heaven interview Boaz about this. I want to see if there's a little twinkle in the eye, because I think it's so strategic how he presents this. He almost casually mentions that buying the land from Naomi carries with it another obligation. He could have presented all that at once, but he didn't. It's kind of like, by the way, there's one more detail in this. With the transfer of property comes the responsibility to marry Ruth. Because remember, it's not just about keeping the land in the family, it's about perpetuating the family line. And so those things go together. The closer relative at this point changes his mind and asks Boaz to replace him. Once again, it's so easy to read this story through our contemporary cultural eyes. It's not like our cultural eyes are glasses we take on and off. Our cultural eyes are LASIK. We don't have any other way of seeing. And that's why study and investigation, and we have to try to, as communicators, build a bridge between the present and the past so we understand it. But it's still impossible to fully see this the way they saw it back then. It's so easy for us to, in our world, we hear this, and I'm troubled that Ruth seems to be lumped into a real estate deal as if she's just another piece of property. You talk about objectifying, and again, through our contemporary eyes, we just shake our heads. But that's not the way their culture worked. And there was such a priority on keeping the land in the family, perpetuating the family line, and there was no government system of provision. The family took that responsibility. So let's just do our best to let that time speak for itself and not interpret it by our values of today. It's so important to try and view these events in their historical context. Land was not only a central strategy toward wealth accumulation, still is today, but also part of God's original covenant with Father Abraham. That same covenant included the promise of family, a growing number of children and generations that would eventually turn Abraham's descendants into a powerful nation and ultimately lead to the birth of the promised Messiah. Cultures and customs change. They may appear strange to us. And you know what? There's an example of that in the very next verse. When we look at the next verse, you'll notice that the writer has put it in parentheses. It's almost like he says, oh, wait a second, to the readers back then, I need to explain to you something because there's a practice that used to be common, but now it's gone away. At most, we're looking at a time span of 100 years probably of gap there. How much more so now, after 3,000 years, is the need for interpretation like this? Look at this. Verse 7 says, parenthesis, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. And he removed his sandal. Apparently, this act of sandal sharing with another person was just as binding as any written contract today. I wonder, did you keep that sandal? I mean, what if you were a real estate developer and had lots of deals? Did you have like filing cabinets, lateral files with all of these in? Did you just take pictures and store digital sandals? Did sometimes you just bought an extra pair because you were in some negotiations? This is just strange to us. And it's interesting that from the time of these actual events to the time of writing this book, that tradition had already gone away. Then in verse 9, Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. Their private agreement was followed by a public announcement. It's a lot of times that way with us. The negotiations may take place in private. A homeowner agrees that, okay, I'll accept this price for the home. But then that process, there's a time when the attorneys or the real estate agents meet together. It's the same thing today. It just happened almost back to back right there. Verse 11, then the elders and all the people at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. The witnesses play an important role, much like witnesses at a wedding do today. When we attend a wedding, we're not just there to watch as spectators. We're not just there to go, so what'd you think of the bridesmaids' dresses? Or, man, that food was really good. I don't even like wedding cake. And that was good. The icing was exceptional. Ultimately, that's not why we're there. That's why most weddings start with, dearly beloved family and friends, we've gathered together in the sight of God and these witnesses. Witnessing a wedding is an active role. We're to serve as witnesses to the covenant they are making with each other, and if it's a Christian marriage, also a covenant with God. When we see them falling into destructive behaviors or drifting from their commitments, as witnesses, we are responsible to remind them, I was there when you took your vows, and do everything that we can to help their relationship thrive. The witnesses bless Boaz, Ruth, and their descendants. It's interesting, they say, like Rachel and Leah did for the family of Israel, or Jacob as we know him. It was Leah and Rachel between them. They bore 12 sons, and those sons became the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So what started as a family really does become a large nation. And then it also throws in the example of Perez. And this is one of those cringeworthy stories. This story is messy. This story does not carry a G or even a PG rating. No way did this story make the cut if you grew up in Sunday school as a child. But you know what? God uses messy situations too. He redeems even the worst possible dysfunction, and He can use it to accomplish His purposes and bring good out of terrible things. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." The Lord blessed Boaz and Ruth with a son. And the women of the town, they worship God and they celebrate His restoration of Naomi. Now she is once again Naomi. She's pleasant. She's probably smiling from ear to ear. The joy is back. No more call me Mara. No more am I bitter. I'm not empty anymore. God has filled me up again. And she's moved from doubting God once again to trusting Him. Verse 16, Naomi took the child in her arms and she cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. We'll talk about those in a minute. Of course, we know that the baby really belonged to Ruth. Her mother-in-law isn't trying to steal her moment, but the women of the town are celebrating God's restoration of their friend Naomi, who once again is full of joy. The rest of the book contains the genealogy of this new baby boy. Let's be honest, it's easy to just let our eyes skim past these verses. We go crazy, especially if you're ever asked to read this out loud at church or your small group. Hard name, begat what's his face, begat so-and-so, begat, I don't even know where to start with that one. But we're not going to do that because these verses contain something we really need to see. Verse 18, this then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Up to this point, everything we've talked about is before this baby is born. What follows is the line that then continues, probably on to the point of what they knew when the writer wrote this book. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. Boaz and Ruth become the great-grandparents of King David, the greatest king Israel ever had. How cool is it that he descended from a foreigner, Ruth the Moabite? David might never have existed had not Ruth committed herself to put the needs of her mother-in-law ahead of her own comfort. Or if Boaz had let Ruth's ethnicity hold him back from fulfilling his role as guardian redeemer. That's amazing when you think of that. So often we think our choices, if it's just a decision between two adults, it doesn't really affect anybody else. This shaped generations and the destiny of a whole nation. But there's something even more important for us to understand, because now more time has passed. We have a broader perspective. We know, as the writer did not, that this little baby was also in the line of Jesus, the promised Messiah, who would sacrifice His life and die on the cross. Any of us who trust in His death as our sin substitute, believe in His resurrection, can have our sins forgiven and be adopted into His eternal family. Even today, God is still grafting people into His family. And He uses failures and disasters and foreigners and losses and setbacks and scandals and brokenness and grief. This is how He brings His people home. This is how He brings you home and me home. God invites each of us then, as members of His family, to partner with Him to help someone else who has lost home or lost hope in the midst of displacement or any other trial or type of grief. When you gather tonight for your discussion, this is your final conversation about this wonderful little book. So take some time and share, why do you think God brought you to this study? What was it that you've heard and seen and learned that you really needed in your own life? There are the big themes of what's going on in our culture, but there's the deeply personal issues as well. They're all dealt with in this book. And if you could, share one lesson that you've learned from each of the three main characters. What have you learned from Naomi? What have you learned from Ruth? And what have you learned from Boaz? Thank you again for the joy of getting to learn together with you. And now jump into this discussion and let's see how God brings together everything that we've been discovering together in the last 6 sessions. I hope to see you again.
Alfa,